The judgment chamber of the Cytherian Empire was a cold place, the kind of cold that sank into your bones and made you forget what warmth felt like. The walls were carved from black stone that seemed to swallow light whole, and the air tasted metallic, like blood and fear. 17-year-old Ethan Brooks stood in the center of it all, his hands bound so tight behind his back that his fingers were going numb. His glasses sat crooked on his face, cracked right down the middle from when the guards had grabbed him. Everything looked split in two now, which felt appropriate somehow. The Serpent Council loomed above him on raised platforms that spiraled up toward the vaulted ceiling. They were massive, these creatures, nothing like the snakes back on Earth. Their scales shimmered and shifted colors like oil spreading across water, and their bodies were thick as old oak trees. When they moved, muscles rippled under those scales with a power that made Ethan's stomach clench. Their eyes were the worst part though, cold, reptilian, ancient beyond measure. Eyes that had seen centuries pass and didn't care about one human boy's life. The High Matriarch was the largest of them all. When she spoke, her voice rattled through the chamber like rocks tumbling down a mountain, and Ethan felt it in his chest. The human child has violated sacred ground. He has seen what no outsider may see and live. Ethan wanted to explain. He wanted to tell them it was an accident, that he'd just been exploring, that he hadn't meant any disrespect. But his mouth was too dry, and his voice had disappeared somewhere between the holding cell and this nightmare courtroom. It was an accident. His mother's voice cracked through the silence like breaking glass. She stood in the observation gallery, tears streaming down her face, her hands gripping the railing so hard her knuckles had gone white. He's just a boy. He didn't know. Ignorance is no defense, the matriarch hissed, and the sound was like steam escaping from a kettle, sharp and angry. The law is ancient. The punishment is clear. Ethan's father, Ambassador Brooks, pushed forward, his diplomatic training crumbling in the face of losing his son. Two Cytherian guards immediately blocked his path, their armored bodies forming an unbreakable wall. Please, there must be another way. He's my son. He's just a kid who reads too much, who wanders where his curiosity takes him. He didn't mean any harm. Then his curiosity has doomed him, the matriarch said, each word dropping like a hammer blow. She turned her massive head toward the guard station near Ethan. Take him to the pit of eternal suffering. Let the sacred guardians decide his fate. 4 guards moved as one. Their hands, if you could call them hands, more like clawed grips at the end of powerful arms, grabbed Ethan from both sides. He tried to resist, digging his sneakers into the polished floor, but it was like a leaf trying to fight a hurricane. His shoes squeaked pathetically against the black stone as they dragged him backward toward a door he hadn't even noticed before. His mother was screaming now, really screaming, the kind of sound a parent makes when their child is being ripped away. His father was shouting, demanding they stop, calling for the Earth Council, for anyone who might help. Other human diplomats in the gallery were on their feet, voices raised in protest, but the Cytherians ignored them all. To these ancient creatures, human voices were nothing but background noise. The massive door swung open and Ethan's terror kicked into overdrive. The smell hit him first, damp earth and stagnant water, but underneath that was something else. Something reptilian and wild and old. Something that spoke to the deepest, most primitive part of his brain that still remembered when humans were prey animals, huddling in caves and hoping the predators passed them by. Darkness waited beyond that door. Not the comfortable darkness of a bedroom at night, but the kind of darkness that felt alive, that felt hungry. Somewhere in that blackness, he heard movement, slithering, scraping, the sound of scales on stone. No, 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 please. Ethan finally found his voice, but it came out small and broken, the voice of a terrified kid, not the brave explorer he'd imagined himself to be when he'd snuck away from the diplomatic quarters. The guards didn't care. With one synchronized motion they threw him through the doorway. For a moment Ethan was airborne, and in that moment he thought about all the books he'd read about brave heroes facing impossible odds. He'd always imagined himself as one of them, smart, resourceful, ready for adventure. But now, falling into darkness with the sound of his mother's screams echoing behind him, he realized he was just a scared kid who'd made a terrible mistake. He hit the ground hard. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs and sent his glasses flying. He rolled across cold, damp stone, his shoulder taking the worst of it. Pain shot through his arm, and for a few seconds, all he could do was lie there, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Behind him, the door slammed shut with a sound like a coffin closing. The bindings on his wrists had come loose in the fall. Ethan pulled his hands free, his fingers shaking so badly he could barely control them. He patted the ground frantically, searching for his glasses, and somehow, miraculously, found them. The crack was worse now, spider webbing across one lens, but they still worked. He put them on and looked around. The chamber was huge, stretching away into darkness that the faint bioluminescent fungi on the walls could barely touch. The fungi glowed a sickly blue-green, just enough light to see shapes moving in the shadows. Coiling shapes. Slithering shapes. Some thin as his arm, others thick enough that he couldn't have wrapped both arms around them. Snakes. Hundreds of them. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. His breath came in short, panicked gasps that echoed off the stone walls. This was it. This was how he died. 17 years old, dead in an alien pit, all because he couldn't resist exploring one more hallway. But then, somewhere in the panic, a thought cut through the fear like a knife. Panicking makes you pray. 6 hours had passed since they'd thrown Ethan Brooks into the pit, and Commander Vierces couldn't stop staring at the surveillance feed. Her scales kept flaring different colors, a telltale sign of irritation among her kind, shifting from deep purple to angry red and back again. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. This wasn't how things had ever gone before. Explain this, she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut stone. The junior guard standing beside her, a young male named Kess, flickered his forked tongue nervously. It was a habit his kind had when stressed, tasting the air for danger that wasn't there. We cannot, Commander. The human remains alive. His vital signs are stable. He has not moved from that spot except once, to retrieve water from a small depression in the rock. Vierwes's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing to slits. Impossible. The last warm blood we threw in the pit lasted 14 minutes. 14. And that one was a trained warrior from the Kelter system, not a soft human child. Yes, Commander. This one has lasted considerably longer. Kess's voice trembled slightly. He'd been assigned to monitor duty as punishment for a minor infraction, and now he was witnessing something that contradicted centuries of tradition. He didn't know if he should report this as an anomaly or keep quiet and hope it resolved itself naturally. On the screen, the human boy sat perfectly still in what appeared to be a carefully chosen position, a flat section of stone that was equidistant from 3 major tunnel openings. The surveillance camera's infrared mode showed his body heat as a bright red-orange blob against the cool blues and greens of the pit. Around him, dozens of cooler signatures moved through the darkness. The sacred guardians. The pit's ancient protectors. And not one of them had attacked him. Down in the pit, Ethan was trying very hard not to think about the fact that he'd been sitting in the same position for 6 hours. His legs had gone numb an hour ago, pins and needles shooting through them every time he shifted even slightly. His back ached from sitting so straight, so still. His throat was dry despite the water he'd carefully collected from a small pool he'd spotted about 10 feet away. But he didn't dare move more than absolutely necessary. He'd chosen this spot carefully after that first terrifying hour when his panic had finally subsided enough for rational thought to kick in. The spot was open, visible from multiple angles, with no hidden corners where something could sneak up on him. Snakes, he'd read in his mother's research files, preferred tight spaces for ambush hunting. They liked to coil in crevices, drop from overhead ledges, or strike from beneath loose rocks. Open ground wasn't their style. It made them visible to both prey and predators, and these creatures were smart enough to conserve their energy. So Ethan had made himself as uninteresting as possible. He breathed slowly in through his nose and out through his mouth, keeping his chest movements minimal. He kept his hands still, resting on his knees. No sudden movements. No prey behavior. No running, no panicking, no flailing around like something that needed to be hunted. He just sat there. Boring. Predictable. Not worth the effort. And incredibly, it seemed to be working. Another serpent slithered past him, close enough that he could have reached out and touched it if he'd lost his mind completely. This one had dark green scales that seemed to absorb the faint light from the glowing fungi, and its eyes, God, its eyes, glowed faintly in the dimness like tiny emeralds. Ethan had started naming them in his head somewhere around hour 3, partly to stay sane and partly because his brain needed something to do besides scream. This one was Ivy. The yellow viper with the aggressive attitude that kept circling back to check on him was Mustard. And the massive black serpent coiled in the far corner, the one that had to be at least 30 feet long and thick as a telephone pole, was Nightmare. Because honestly, what else would you call something that could probably swallow you whole without even unhinging its jaw too much? Ethan's datapad rested on his lap, the screen dimmed to its lowest setting to conserve battery. He'd been reading through his files, trying to understand what he'd stumbled into, trying to make sense of how a diplomatic mission had turned into a death sentence so quickly. He'd been supposed to stay in the diplomatic quarters. His parents had been very clear about that. The Cytherians were hosting a cultural exchange, showing the human delegation their capital city, their art, their history. It was supposed to be educational and peaceful. But Ethan had never been good at following rules when there was something interesting to explore. So he'd snuck out, wandered the temple complex, followed a corridor that looked old and mysterious and exactly like something from the adventure books he loved. And he'd found the breeding chambers, massive pools filled with eggs and young serpents, tended by what he now realized were religious caretakers. Sacred ground. Holy of holies. And he'd walked right into it with his datapad out, taking pictures like a tourist. The Cytherians had grabbed him within seconds. His glasses had cracked when one of the guards had yanked him backward, and he dropped his datapad in a panic before realizing he still had the smaller backup one in his jacket pocket. That piece of luck might be the only reason he was still breathing. A brown serpent with copper-colored bands moved toward his position. Ethan's pulse quickened. He couldn't help it, his body's fight-or-flight response was still very much active, but he forced himself to remain still. The snake moved closer. Closer. Its tongue flickered out, tasting the air, analyzing this strange warm thing that had invaded its territory. Then something remarkable happened. The snake, instead of striking or moving away, coiled itself near his left leg. Not touching him, not threatening him, just settling in. Like a cat finding a sunny spot on the floor. Ethan barely dared to breathe. Slowly, carefully, he glanced down at the creature. It had closed its eyes, or whatever snakes did that passed for closing eyes, and seemed to be relaxing into the position. Then it hit him. Body heat. He was warm. These creatures were cold-blooded, living in a cold stone pit deep underground. To them he wasn't just a non-threat. He was a heat source. A warm rock. Something comfortable to curl up next to. Despite everything, the fear, the exhaustion, the very real possibility that he might still die down here, Ethan felt a tiny smile tug at his lips. "Okay," he whispered to the snake, his voice barely audible. "You can stay. I'll call you Copper." Up in the guard station, Kess watched the impossible scene unfold on his monitor. "Commander," he said quietly, "the serpents they're accepting him." Virwisa said nothing for a long moment, her scales rippling with an emotion she couldn't name. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is this human doing?" 3 days in the pit. Ethan had completely lost track of whether it was day or night in the world above. Down here time moved differently. There was no sun to mark the hours, no clock on the wall, no morning alarm to wake him up. Just the constant dim glow of the bioluminescent fungi that clung to the walls like nature's nightlights, and the fading glow of his datapad screen, which now showed a worrying 23% battery remaining. He'd learned the patterns though. That was the thing about being stuck in one place with nothing to do but observe, you started noticing things. The snakes had rhythms, routines, behaviors that repeated with remarkable consistency. During what Ethan guessed were the nighttime hours in the facility above, the serpents became active. They moved with purpose through the tunnels, hunting the pale, eyeless rodents that scurried through the darkness. These creatures, he'd started calling them cave mice though they were probably nothing like earth mice, had adapted to a life without light. They were almost translucent, their skin so thin you could see the shadow of their organs beneath. The snakes hunted them with efficient, patient precision. No wasted energy. No unnecessary movement. Just patience and then a strike so fast Ethan's eyes could barely track it. During what he assumed were the daytime hours, the serpents became sluggish. They found warm spots, cracks in the rock that held residual heat, patches of stone that absorbed warmth from some unknown source, and coiled there, conserving energy, digesting their meals, resting until the next hunt. Ethan had become one of those warm spots. Copper rarely left his side now. The brown and copper-banded snake had claimed the space near his left leg as her personal territory. She'd coil there for hours, soaking up his body heat, occasionally shifting position when he had to move to keep his circulation going. Ivy, the green serpent with the glowing eyes, checked on him regularly like she was making rounds, slithering past every few hours as if to confirm he was still there and still behaving himself. Even Mustard, the aggressive yellow viper that had terrified him that first day, had stopped treating him as a threat. She tested him a few times, getting close, hissing, watching for any sign of prey behavior. But Ethan had remained calm, still, respectful, and eventually Mustard had lost interest. Now she mostly ignored him unless he accidentally moved into what she considered her hunting corridor. Only Nightmare, the massive black serpent in the far corner, kept his distance. That creature was different from the others. Older, Ethan thought. More intelligent. Its eyes followed him with an awareness that made his skin prickle. Sometimes he'd wake from an uncomfortable doze to find Nightmare watching him from the shadows, those ancient eyes reflecting the fungi's glow like tiny stars. It wasn't hostile exactly, but it wasn't friendly either. It was evaluating him, judging him, waiting for something. Ethan had done his best to map the pit. He'd torn strips from his shirt, it was already ruined anyway, stained with dirt and damp and God knows what else, and tied them to rocks to mark safe paths. Little fabric flags that showed routes he'd tested, areas where the snakes rarely went, tunnels that led to dead ends versus ones that opened into larger chambers. He'd found the central spring on day 2, and it had probably saved his life. Clean water bubbled up from somewhere deep underground, creating a small pool about 6 inches deep. The water was cold and tasted faintly metallic, but it was drinkable. He'd tested it carefully, small sips at first, waiting to see if his stomach rebelled, and when nothing bad happened, he'd drunk his fill. He'd located the warmest spots in the pit, a cluster of rocks near the eastern wall that stayed noticeably warmer than the surrounding stone, and the coolest ones down in a lower chamber where the air felt damp and cold enough to make him shiver. He'd documented everything in his datapad. 17 different species of serpent, ranging from the small 6-inch green tree snakes that hung from the ceiling fungus to the massive constrictors like Nightmare. 12 varieties of fungi, each with slightly different colors and growth patterns. 8 types of cave-dwelling creatures that the serpents hunted, the blind mice, some kind of pale cricket, a few species he couldn't identify at all. His mother would be proud of his field work, he thought. She'd spent her whole career studying alien ecosystems, and here he was, conducting observational research in the most hostile environment imaginable. If she ever saw him again. That thought hit like a punch to the gut. His parents had watched him get thrown into this pit. They'd screamed for him, fought for him, and been powerless to stop it. Were they still up there? Had they been forced to leave? Did they think he was dead? Ethan pushed the thought away before it could spiral into panic. He couldn't afford to think about that. Couldn't afford to let the fear back in. So he did what he always did when emotions got too big. He buried himself in research. He was deep in a section about Cytherian religious practices, reading by the dim light of his screen, when a passage made him freeze mid-breath. The sacred coils, ancestral serpents blessed by the First Mother, are believed to guard the holiest sites. These creatures are not mere animals but revered ancestors, returned to physical form to protect the most sacred spaces of Cytherian culture. To earn their acceptance is to earn the favor of the gods themselves. To be acknowledged by the sacred coils is to be marked as worthy in the eyes of the divine. Ethan's hands started shaking. He read the passage again. Then again. Slowly, very slowly, he looked up from his screen. Copper was coiled against his leg, trusting and relaxed. Ivy was draped over a rock 3 feet away, her head resting on her coils. Mustard was visible in a side tunnel, ignoring him completely. And in the far corner, Nightmare watched with those impossibly intelligent eyes. "Oh my God," Ethan whispered into the darkness. "You're not guards. You're not even just animals." The words felt heavy, significant, like speaking them out loud changed something fundamental about his situation. "Your ancestors. This isn't a prison." He looked around at the carved walls, at the patterns worn into the stone by centuries of serpentine movement, at the careful way the fungi grew in specific formations. "This is a temple." Commander Vieras descended into the pit herself, her plasma blade already drawn and humming with deadly energy. She'd had enough of watching the surveillance feeds, enough of the impossible reports from her guards, enough of this human child making a mockery of everything her people held sacred. 3 days was too long. 3 days was an insult to tradition, to the law, to the memory of every Cytherian who'd proven themselves worthy in these tunnels. She would end this personally. The tunnels were cold and damp as she made her way deeper, the temperature dropping with each step downward. Her helmet's light cut through the darkness in a harsh white beam, illuminating the ancient stone walls, the patches of glowing fungi, the worn grooves in the floor where countless serpents had slithered for generations. She knew these paths intimately. Every Cytherian warrior did. This was where they tested their own youth, where the weak were separated from the strong, where genetic imperfection was culled naturally by tooth and venom. Only the worthy survived the pit. Only the strong earned the right to continue their bloodline. It was brutal, yes. But it was their way. It had been their way for thousands of years. No outsider had ever been thrown into the pit and lived. None. In all the centuries of Cytherian history, every foreign prisoner sent to face the sacred guardians had died within the first day. Most within the first hour. The longest any warm-blooded creature had lasted was that Kelter warrior, and even he'd only managed 14 minutes before the venom stopped his heart. Until this human child. This soft, weak, bookish human child who should have been dead before the door even closed behind him. VROSS's scales rippled with anger as she moved through the tunnels. Her kind showed emotion through color changes, and right now she was practically glowing with rage. How dare this outsider survive? How dare he make a mockery of their most sacred trial? She rounded the final corner into the center chamber, her weapon raised, fully prepared to strike the moment she saw him. And then she stopped dead. The human boy sat cross-legged on the stone floor in the heart of the chamber, the most sacred spot in the entire pit. Copper was coiled near his left side, her brown and copper-banded body relaxed in a way that suggested complete trust. Ivy rested nearby, her green scales catching the fungi's glow. Mustard, the aggressive yellow viper who'd killed 3 young Cytherians during their trials, lay draped across a rock like a lazy house pet. But that wasn't what made VROSS's breath catch in her throat. That wasn't what made her scales go rigid with shock. Behind the human boy, in a position of protection that couldn't be misinterpreted, was Nightmare. The Great One himself. The oldest and most revered of all the sacred guardians, a creature who'd lived in these tunnels for over 2 centuries, who'd seen 1,000 Cytherians come and go, who'd killed countless unworthy challengers. The Great One was positioned between the human and the entrance VROSS had just come through, protecting him. VROSS's weapon arm trembled. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But what made her heart nearly stop wasn't the snakes. It was what the human was doing. He was reading. Out loud. In Cytherian. And the First Mother shed her skin 7 times before the stars aligned. Ethan's voice carried through the chamber, his pronunciation remarkably clear for a species without a forked tongue. The sacred texts. He was reading the sacred texts. Each skin became a world, each world a child, each child a promise of eternity. He must have sensed her presence or heard her armored footsteps because he looked up. His eyes widened behind those cracked glasses when he saw her, and for a moment, pure human fear flashed across his face. That expression was honest, real, completely understandable. But he didn't run. Didn't scream. Didn't scramble backward in panic. Instead, he closed his datapad carefully, set it aside, and stood up slowly. Every movement was deliberate, careful, respectful. He was being cautious not to disturb Copper, who'd been resting against him. "Commander Virus," he said quietly, and his voice was steady despite the fear she could smell on him. He'd recognized her rank markings somehow, understood their military hierarchy. "I'm Ethan Brooks. I think there's been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Viros's voice came out as a hiss, sharp and dangerous. She took a step forward, her blade still raised. "You violated our most sacred space. You were sentenced to death by the Council itself. There is no misunderstanding, human child." "I know what I did was wrong," Ethan said, and he had the sense to look genuinely apologetic. "I shouldn't have wandered into the breeding chambers. I wasn't thinking. I was just curious and I made a terrible mistake. I understand why you're angry." "Angry?" VROSS's scales flared bright red. "You understand nothing. You have survived 3 days in the pit. 3 days. Do you know what that means? Do you comprehend the impossibility of what you have done?" "I'm beginning to," Ethan said softly, glancing at the serpents around him. "This isn't just a prison, is it? It's not even really a punishment. It's a test. A sacred trial." VROSS's weapon lowered slightly. How could he know that? How could this outsider understand in 3 days what took Cytherian scholars years to comprehend? "You should be dead," she said, her voice quieter now but no less intense. "Every instinct, every law of nature, every precedent says you should be dead. Yet you sit here, reading our sacred texts, surrounded by the guardians who should have torn you apart." "They didn't tear me apart because I didn't give them a reason to," Ethan said. He gestured toward Copper, toward Ivy, toward the Great One behind him. "I watched them. I learned their patterns. I showed respect. I wasn't prey, wasn't a threat, wasn't worth the energy to hunt. I was just there. Quiet. Observant. Boring." "Boring?" Versus repeated, and despite everything, she felt something that might have been amusement ripple through her. "You claim you survived by being boring?" "Pretty much, yeah." Ethan managed a weak smile. "Turns out being the nerdy kid who reads too much and doesn't like loud noises is actually perfect survival training for a pit full of sacred snakes." The Serpent Council's emergency session was unprecedented. In over 3,000 years of recorded Cytherian history, the Council had never once reconvened to reconsider a judgment they'd already passed. The law was absolute. It had to be absolute or it meant nothing. Justice wasn't something you could take back or change your mind about halfway through. Once the council spoke, their word was final. Except now it wasn't. Because Ethan Brooks stood before them again, filthy and exhausted but alive and unharmed, and everything about his survival challenged the most fundamental beliefs of their entire civilization. The judgment chamber felt different this time. The black stone walls seemed less oppressive somehow, or maybe that was just because Ethan had spent 3 days in near darkness and anything with decent lighting felt like a gift. The council members on their raised platforms looked just as imposing as before. Massive serpentine bodies, scales that shifted colors with their emotions, eyes that had seen centuries pass. But Ethan wasn't quite as terrified anymore. He'd spent 3 days surrounded by their sacred guardians. These council members were intimidating, sure, but they weren't 30-foot constrictors who could crush his ribs with one squeeze. The High Matriarch spoke first, her voice measured and careful in a way it hadn't been during his sentencing. The law states that those who violate the sacred chambers must face the trial of the pit. You have faced this trial, human child. Against all possibility, against all precedent, against every expectation we held, you have survived. More than survived, Commander Viertus added, stepping forward from her position at the chamber's edge. Her scales had settled into a deep blue contemplation, Ethan had learned, and her voice carried authority but also something that might have been respect. I have submitted my full report to the council. Every detail of the human's 3 days has been documented, witnessed, verified by multiple surveillance systems. He has been accepted by the sacred guardians. The Great One himself, the oldest and most revered creature in our keeping, has acknowledged him. Murmurs rippled through the assembled council like wind through grass. Some members' scales flared red with anger. Others shifted to yellow, fascination. A few turned purple with confusion. All of them were clearly struggling to process information that contradicted everything they thought they knew. Ethan glanced toward the observation gallery and felt his throat tighten. His mother sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face, her hands pressed against the glass barrier like she could reach through it and touch him. His father sat beside her, gripping her hand so tightly his knuckles had gone white. They'd been told their son was alive, Viertus had informed them an hour ago, but they hadn't seen him yet, hadn't been allowed to confirm it with their own eyes until this moment. His mom mouthed something. It looked like, "I love you." Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to respond without breaking down completely. A council member on the left platform, smaller than the matriarch but with scales that gleamed like polished silver, spoke up, his voice sharp with suspicion. "How did you do it? What sorcery did you use? What technology? What deception allowed you to fool the sacred guardians?" "No sorcery," Ethan said, and he was surprised to hear his own voice come out stronger than he felt. His legs were shaking and his hands wanted to tremble, but his voice held steady. No technology beyond a datapad full of research files. No deception at all. Just observation. Patience. Respect. He took a breath, gathering his thoughts. He'd practiced this speech in his head during those long hours in the pit, but actually saying it out loud to a room full of ancient, powerful beings was completely different. "Your sacred guardians are incredible creatures," he continued. "Intelligent, selective, purposeful. They didn't kill me because I showed them I wasn't a threat. Because I took time to understand their patterns, when they hunted, when they rested, how they moved, what triggered their hunting instincts. Because I treated them like the revered ancestors they are, not like mindless beasts to be feared." He pulled out his datapad, its screen showing a critical 3% battery. The device had been his lifeline, his comfort, his salvation down in that darkness. "I documented everything," Ethan said, holding up the datapad. 17 different species of serpent, their individual hunting patterns, their territorial behaviors, their social structures. 12 varieties of fungi and how they create the ecosystem that supports everything else. 8 types of prey animals and how they've adapted to life in total darkness. I can show you things about your own sacred creatures that you might not know. Not because I'm special or because humans are better than Cytherians, but because I had 3 days to do nothing but watch and learn." He paused, and this was the scary part. This was where he had to be brave in a completely different way than surviving the pit. "Your pit is dying," he said bluntly. The council erupted. Scales flared red across multiple platforms. Voices rose in angry hisses. One council member half rose from his coils, clearly ready to call for Ethan's immediate execution. But the High Matriarch raised one massive claw, and silence fell like a hammer. "Explain yourself, human child," she said, her voice deadly quiet. Ethan's mouth went dry, but he pushed forward. "The ecosystem is collapsing. The prey populations are declining because the fungi that support them are dying from some kind of blight in the eastern tunnels. Some of the serpents show signs of malnutrition. You can see it in their scale condition, their movement patterns. The natural spring that feeds the whole system is starting to divert because of a rock shift, probably from the construction I saw happening on the upper levels. He met the matriarch's eyes, terrified but determined. You've made this place so sacred that no one actually tends to it anymore. You're killing it with neglect. And I can help fix it. If you'll let me.